the 6th of June, 1944. After a colossal naval bombardment, thousands of Allied troops weighed ashore in Normandy in northwest France. The liberation of occupied Europe had begun. Behind the operation lay the most brilliant deception campaign in military history. What were the secrets of D-Day? In the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler sat at the center of an empire which stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the mountains of the Caucasus in Russia. His triumphant armies were driving towards the Soviet city of Stalingrad in a campaign designed to knock the Russians out of the war. Mastery of Europe seemed within Hitler's grasp. But as early as the spring of 1941, even before he had invaded Russia, Hitler was strengthening his defenses against an invasion in the West. He ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, stretching from Norway to the Spanish frontier. It was to be the first line of defense in Hitler's fortress Europe. The Atlantic Wall was strongest on the northern coast of France, where an invasion of Europe from Britain was most likely to come. The Pas-de-Calais, the coast of Normandy, and the Atlantic seaboard bristled with gun emplacements, minefields, and obstacle-strewn beaches. In 1942, Hitler's conquests had seemed secure. But by the autumn of 1943, his armies were on the retreat. In Russia that summer, the cream of Hitler's panzer formations had been savagely mauled and driven back to the river Dnieper. The British and Americans had cleared North Africa and landed in Italy. Germany's cities were taking an increasingly terrible hammering from Allied bombers. Hamburg had been swept by firestorms, and more cities were to suffer the same fate. Hitler prepared to go on the defensive. On the 3rd of November 1943, he issued Führer Directive No. 51, in which he declared, "Everything indicates that the enemy will launch an offensive against the western front of Europe, at the latest in the spring, perhaps even earlier." In October 1943, work on the Atlantic Wall was redoubled under the energetic command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel believed he would inflict a second Dunkirk on the British and their American allies. The Americans had entered the war on the 8th of December 1941, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. 3 days later, Germany and Italy had declared war on America. At the end of December, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill met in Washington, D.C. Here at the Arcadia Conference, they agreed on what became known as the Germany First policy. In spite of the war now raging in the Far East, the defeat of Nazi Germany was to be the major Allied priority. Britain was to be the springboard for an invasion of Europe. The first American troops began to arrive in the United Kingdom in January 1942. Thereafter, the build-up was relentless. By the spring of 1944, nearly 1 million GIs had arrived, plus a mountain of munitions, weapons, and supplies. The Americans and the Russians wanted to invade Europe at the earliest opportunity. The Russians, who were taking colossal casualties on the Eastern Front, also pressed for an immediate invasion, what the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin called the opening of a second front. The British were more wary. In August 1942, a large-scale raid on the heavily defended Channel port of Dieppe had come to grief. The carnage on the shingle beach at Dieppe underlined the dangers of launching a premature invasion. The date for the invasion of Europe, codenamed Overlord, was put back to the middle of 1944. Planning had begun in March 1943. In charge was the 49-year-old Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, Chief of Staff to a Supreme Allied Commander yet to be appointed. Morgan was known as Cossack for short. His small Anglo-American staff set up shop in a former bank boardroom on the 6th floor of Norfolk House in London's St. James's Square. Morgan faced a daunting task. General Sir Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, told him, "It won't work, but you must bloody well make it." The operational range of the Spitfire, the most numerous Allied fighter, was used to establish the zone in which the Allies would enjoy unchallenged air superiority, the prerequisite of any invasion plan. The Spitfire zone stretched from the Pas-de-Calais to the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy. Inside this zone there were only two areas suitable for an invasion: the Pas-de-Calais, with its gently shelving sandy beaches, and the Normandy coast between the Seine and the Cotentin Peninsula. The Pas-de-Calais offered the Allies the shortest route to Germany. The German High Command anticipated that the main blow would fall here. Cossack decided to wrong-foot them. In June 1943, Morgan chose Normandy. In the history of warfare, no stretch of coastline has been reconnoitred in such minute detail. Aerial reconnaissance aircraft played their part. As did observant members of the French resistance, who kept a close watch on the Atlantic Wall and the defenses which lay behind it. Other methods were more unconventional. In the spring of 1942, a radio broadcast had asked the British public to send holiday snaps and postcards of the North European coast to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, the wartime home of the Inter-Services Topographical Unit. Thousands of photos and cards poured in. The views of Normandy yielded vital information. Tiny details, like the height of a woman's skirts when paddling, could indicate the gradient of a beach. A closer look was also being taken. On dark nights, special parties were secretly put ashore in Normandy to map the beaches and take samples of the sand. They carried cyanide pills in case of capture. These meticulous surveys, made under German guns, pinpointed the best routes on and off the 5 target beaches chosen for the Normandy invasion. Science and technology were applied to every aspect of the operation, not always successfully. This Kapok landing stage, codenamed Argosy, failed its trials. Even more optimistic was Aquato, designed to land a fully equipped soldier in Normandy behind his own personal tank, a maneuver which required the combined skills of an Olympic swimmer and Hollywood stuntman. The Great Panjandrum was designed to destroy beach obstacles, but threatened to wreak more havoc among the invaders than the defenders of Normandy. Of more practical use were the so-called funnies, used by 79th Armored Division to give close support to the assault infantry. Its specialized tanks included the Crab, a Sherman equipped with a flail to set off mines. Swimming tanks were developed and bunker-busting flamethrowers. Rocket-assisted grapnels were designed to enable US Ranger battalions to scale the steep cliffs which loomed over their target beaches in Normandy. On the day, they worked well. Above all, the Allied Supreme Commander, the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had to keep the Germans guessing about where and when the invasion would come. The success of Overlord depended on an elaborate deception plan. It was codenamed Fortitude, and its aim was to convince Hitler and his generals that the main invasion would be mounted in the Pas-de-Calais, even after the Normandy landings had begun. At the heart of Fortitude was a special agency, the London Controlling Section, headed by 2 English officers, Colonel John Bevan and Lieutenant Colonel Sir Ronald Wingate. Their trade was disinformation, designed to fool the information-gathering and counter-espionage arm of German intelligence the Abwehr. They had their work cut out. As spring gave way to early summer, nearly 2 million men were crammed into southern England, the Americans in the West Country and the British and Canadians farther to the east, around the ports of Southampton and Portsmouth. So vast was the gathering invasion armada that 2 of its 7 seaborne elements had to be harboured as far away as South Wales and East Anglia. Roads and railways were creaking under the strain of carrying millions of tons of supplies and ammunition to the embarkation points. 2 massive artificial harbours, codenamed Mulberries, and each the size of a 6-storey building, were waiting to be towed to France after the landings. Once the troops were ashore, fuel supplies would be ensured by an aluminium alloy pipeline under the ocean, or Pluto, which was laid between the Isle of Wight and Normandy. Its terminal on the Isle of Wight was camouflaged as a golf club and adjoining cafe. Swathes of southern farmland were covered from horizon to horizon with tanks, guns and aircraft. A current joke ran that only the thousands of barrage balloons bobbing over Britain's cities kept the island from sinking beneath the waves. Surely the German Air Force was following these developments with interest. The simple fact was that it couldn't. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The first air fleet on the Channel coast mustered only 170 aircraft. In the first 6 months of 1944, it managed only a handful of daytime flights over Britain. The Luftwaffe had left the Abwehr flying blind. But the Abwehr had another source of information on which it set great store: its network of spies in Britain. Their reports were eagerly assessed for indications of the strength, timing, and above all, the objectives of the invasion that would surely come. Unfortunately for the Abwehr, all their agents were working for the British. They had been turned by British counter-espionage. Those who had refused to cooperate had been executed. Wolf Dietrich Schmidt had parachuted into England in September 1940. He had been captured within 24 hours and passed into the hands of a special section of MI5 codenamed B1A, which was under the overall control of the aptly named Double Cross Committee. Schmidt was given the codename Tate, and for the next 4 years was kept busy in a series of safe houses, radioing back a cocktail of misleading information to his Abwehr controllers. Tate was soon followed by other double agents, all busily running an imaginary spy network. To foster the German illusion that the invasion was aimed at the Pas-de-Calais, the Allies also created a phantom army of 150,000 men, the first US Army Group, or FUSAG, supposedly massed in Kent near Dover. Kentish fields suddenly sprouted squadrons of dummy fighters. They would have looked impressive enough to any stray German reconnaissance aircraft, but they were, quite literally, no more than hot air. Make-believe bombers stood by their wooden fuel bowsers. Workmen built jetties that would never receive ships. Kentish harbours displayed an armada of dummy landing craft. From the end of April 1944, the air buzzed with FUSAG's radio traffic, all of which was designed to be intercepted by the German listeners. Commanding the imaginary FUSAG was the flamboyant American tank general George S. Patton. No shrinking violet, Patton could be relied upon to figure, controversially and often, in newspaper headlines, and in consequence, in German intelligence reports. FUSAG's 150,000 men did exist as Patton's US Third Army, but none of them was anywhere near Dover. Nevertheless, Tate sent a string of detailed reports to Germany about the army that never was. Another busy double agent was a remarkable young Spanish journalist, Juan Piol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. Garbo was a staunch anti-Nazi who had persuaded the Abwehr to employ him. He then offered his services to the British, working through his case officer, Tommy Harris. On his own initiative, Garbo invented an imaginary network of nearly 30 sub-agents working for him in Britain. He even had a fictional mistress, strategically placed in the Women's Royal Naval Service. Garbo's fantasy spy ring was soon busy in the Dover area, averaging about 4 calls a day to his German controller in Madrid. Garbo also had a dry sense of humor. On the 21st of April, he urged his controller to remain calm and confident. All was going well, in spite of the tricks the Allies used. The third double agent, a Polish airman, Wing Commander Roman Gabi Czerniawski, codenamed Brutus, was placed inside the fictional Fuzak headquarters as a liaison officer. Both Garbo and Brutus were providing the Abwehr with creative disinformation as the first Allied troops went ashore in Normandy on the 6th of June. To further confuse the Germans, London Controlling Centre ensured that fantasy was mixed with snippets of fact. Garbo and Brutus fed the Abwehr nuggets of accurate information about selected units in the invasion force. When these real units turned up in Normandy, the double agent's reputation for reliability could only rise. Hitler was so impressed that on the 29th of July 1944, he awarded Garbo the Iron Cross, second class, for his extraordinary merits. A subsidiary part of Fortitude aimed to convince the Germans that Norway was the target of an Allied invasion. A phantom Fourth Army was created, based in Scotland and supposedly commanded by a British general whom Hitler had met in the 1930s. Edinburgh Castle housed Fourth Army. 100 elderly officers supported by a few dozen wireless operators responsible for its huge and wildly indiscreet radio traffic. 2 double agents, codenamed Mutt and Jeff, informed the Abwehr that Fourth Army was at least 250,000 men strong, a considerable overestimate. Wireless messages designed to be intercepted requested thousands of ski bindings for operations in the frozen north. The Germans were convinced that Fourth Army posed a credible threat to Scandinavia, but they did not alter any of the dispositions they had already made to deal with it. They knew that the real threat lay across the Channel. Meanwhile, the Allies kept them guessing. The pattern of air bombardment which preceded the invasion gave nothing away. Before D-Day, the Allies attacked nearly 50 airfields within 50 miles of the city of Caen. Of these, 11 were in the Pas-de-Calais and only 4 in Normandy. Attacks on coastal defenses and radar installations in the Pas-de-Calais were twice as heavy as those made in Normandy. On the 29th of May, a massive air attack was launched on the Pas-de-Calais from airfields in Kent. By May 1944, Cossack had given way to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF. For General Eisenhower, the last nail-biting weeks before the invasion were a security nightmare. General Morgan warned that if the enemy obtained as much as 48 hours advance warning of the assault area, disaster would ensue. A blanket of security descended over Britain, but this did not prevent a succession of scares. In a bizarre coincidence at the beginning of May, the crossword in the Daily Telegraph newspaper contained several of the key code words for the invasion, including Overlord itself. A British staff officer mislaid the entire communications plan for the invasion. A taxi driver handed it in, still in its briefcase, marked top secret. An American sergeant charged with sending Overlord plans to the Pentagon got them mixed up with a parcel of clothes he posted to a lady friend who lived in a German area of Chicago. A huge operation was mounted to intercept the parcel, which was retrieved in the nick of time. The most serious scare came at the end of April. German fast attack craft got in among a convoy of landing ships, packed with US infantry, which were taking part in an invasion exercise off Portland Bill. 639 American servicemen were lost. Among them were 10 bigots, the code name for officers with special knowledge of the Overlord plan. Not until the grisly business of recovering all the bodies was completed could the Allies breathe freely again. The incident was hushed up until years after the war. Almost at the last minute, Hitler's famous intuition refocused attention on Normandy. At the beginning of May, he ordered the strengthening of the defenses in Normandy, particularly against attacks by air-landing troops. But the moment passed. Overlord was only a month away, but thanks to fortitude, the Germans had no greater insight into Allied intentions than they had had at the beginning of the year. The date for D-Day had been set for the 5th of June, but bad weather forced a delay for another 24 hours. In France, the Germans continued to agonize about the threat they faced. On the evening of the 5th of June, the German commander in France, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, reported to Hitler that the expected invasion was not yet imminent. 8 hours later, the horizon off the Normandy coast was filled with ships by the thousand. The planes carrying the air-landing troops which Hitler feared had taken off. The countdown to the naval bombardment had begun. As thousands of aircraft thundered overhead, the cliff tops on the shore were shrouded in smoke. The invasion had begun. But as Allied bombers continued to pound the Atlantic wall between Dieppe and Calais, the Germans remained mesmerized by the non-existent threat to the Pas-de-Calais. Powerful panzer formations were held back there to meet an invasion which never came. The Allies were going ashore in Normandy. Much hard fighting lay ahead, but fortitude had provided a triumphant shield of deception for the greatest amphibious operation of the war. When the Allies burst out of the Normandy bridgehead, the crowds who cheered them on their way had no inkling of the deception plan which preceded the invasion of Europe. The Allies had men and materiel in abundance, but risked defeat if the Germans had known where they were going to land. There were only two choices, but the Allies convinced the enemy that it was in the Pas-de-Calais that they intended to breach the Atlantic Wall. And it was here that Hitler held back vital armored divisions even after the Normandy landings. The British pride themselves on their sense of fair play, but they excelled in the dirty tricks of the deception game. The work of double agents like Garbo and Brutus was vital to the success of Overlord. It was a war of mirrors which the Allies won and which the Germans lost.